America lost 9 astronauts on the way to the moon. 6 of them died in military aircraft. Every one of them was a hand-picked test pilot. Every one of them was killed by American hardware before he could ever reach the moon. And the deadliest piece of that hardware was never the rocket. It was a 2-seat trainer called the T-38 Talon. 38 months, 3 airframes, 1 command module, 9 funerals, cross-referenced against the accident boards that closed each file. Bury one of these stories, and Neil Armstrong never walks on the moon. You have been told Apollo was America's greatest engineering triumph. It was also a body count. On February 28, 1966, 2 men took off from Houston with a simple plan: fly to St. Louis, check on their own spacecraft at the factory where it was being built, come home Monday. Neither of them made it to the factory door. They crashed into it. Elliot C. and Charlie Bassett were the prime crew of Gemini 9, the mission that was going to test the astronaut maneuvering unit that would send a man flying free in the vacuum. At the moment of impact, the capsule they were supposed to fly was parked less than 200 yards away, untouched, waiting for them. C was 38, commander in the Naval Reserve, carrier pilot of the F-9F Panther, later a test pilot for General Electric with more than 3,300 hours in jets. Neil Armstrong said one thing about him, and that one thing is enough. Elliot is too good a pilot not to have a command of his own. Bassett was 34, lieutenant colonel in the Air Force Reserve, graduate of the Air Force Test Pilot School. He was going to be the pilot of Gemini 9, the man who would step out into the vacuum tied to an experimental rocket backpack, the most ambitious spacewalk the United States had ever attempted. Both men were married. Both had 3 children. That morning they were flying in formation, 2 T-38s. In the first one, C and Bassett. In the second, their backups, Tom Stafford and Gene Cernan. When the formation arrived over Lambert Field at 8:25 in the morning, St. Louis was wrapped in an 800-foot ceiling, light rain, light snow, and 1.5 miles of visibility. The official NASA panel called it, in its own words, marginal weather. Both aircraft missed the first approach. Stafford executed the standard missed approach procedure. C made a different call. He rolled into a low visual circle, very low, trying to find the runway underneath the cloud deck. Deke Slayton would say it later with a pilot's flat cruelty. He wasn't aggressive enough. He flew too slow. And that is a fatal problem in a T-38, which will stall out below 270 knots. At 500 feet, C rolled into a full 360-degree turn to the southeast. He wasn't orienting himself. He was falling. The turn carried him directly toward the McDonnell Industrial Complex. 3 seconds before impact, telemetry recorded 2 inputs from the cockpit. Afterburner selected. Bank angle reduced. C saw what was coming and fought it. It wasn't enough. At 8:58, the T-38 struck the roof of McDonnell Building 101, the building where, at that exact moment, his Gemini 9 was being assembled. The fuselage tore through the roof, punched through the hangar, and came to rest in the parking lot outside, a few yards from the untouched capsule. 16 workers were injured, none seriously. The official board, chaired by Alan Shepard, ruled pilot error in marginal conditions, but that administrative verdict hides a much larger consequence. When C and Bassett died, Stafford and Cernan moved from backups to prime. That reassignment triggered a chain of substitutions that placed Cernan, 3 years later, in the lunar module of Apollo 17. The last man to walk on the moon got there because Elliot C. flew too low over St. Louis. And yet C and Bassett were not the first. 16 months earlier, another NASA pilot had already died in the same model of aircraft. It wasn't the weather that killed him, it was a goose. And how his widow found out changed forever the way the agency notified a death. That pilot's name was Theodore Cordy Freeman. Everyone called him Ted. And on October 31, 1964, he became the first NASA astronaut killed on active duty. Freeman was 34, captain in the Air Force, graduate of the Naval Academy, then a test pilot trained at Edwards. When NASA announced the third group of astronauts in October 1963, Freeman was one of the 14 chosen. His assigned specialty was propulsion system development for Apollo. He was married to Faith. They had one daughter. She was also named Faith. That morning he was flying alone in a NASA-modified Tu-38A. He was returning to Ellington from St. Louis, from the McDonnell complex, the exact same destination Elliot C. would fly to 16 months later. Absolute routine. Nothing about this mission should have killed him. But during the second approach to Ellington, something appeared on the windscreen. It was a snow goose. A male Anser carolensis, white plumage with black wingtips, traveling in formation with its migratory flock heading south. Live weight, 4 to 6 pounds. Combined relative velocity at impact, around 450 miles per hour. The bird struck the forward canopy. The plexiglass shattered, and the fragments, dragged by the airstream, went straight into the port intake. The debris ingested the compressor. Seconds later, the starboard engine also failed, contaminated by the same debris. Dual flame out. Freeman was left without propulsion below 2,000 feet, over a residential area next to the base. And this is where it stops being an aviation statistic and becomes a human decision. Freeman still had aerodynamic control. He knew he wasn't going to reach the runway. He also knew what was underneath him. Base housing. Families. Instead of gliding in a straight line toward the safety of Ellington, he rolled left, away from the houses, toward open ground. That turn cost him the seconds he needed to eject cleanly. At about 100 feet above the ground, he pulled the handle. The parachute had no time to open. Faith Freeman was at home in Timber Cove, Houston. It was a Saturday morning. NASA still had no formal protocol for notifying the families of dead astronauts, because until that day, it had never needed one. The doorbell rang. On the porch was a Houston reporter named Jim Schefter. He asked Faith how she felt about her husband's death. That is how she found out. NASA didn't officially know yet. The agency lost the race against a reporter by a matter of minutes, and a woman learned she was a widow from a question asked on her own front step. Deke Slayton pulled the astronauts together that same week. The new rule was carved in stone without a piece of paper being written. When one of ours dies, another astronaut tells the family. Before the press, before the agency. That protocol, written in the blood of Ted Freeman, would still be in force when C died, when Williams died, when Grissom, White, and Chaffee burned inside the capsule. But the technical lesson from Freeman was only half learned. The T-38 kept flying with the same intake, the same canopy, the same vulnerability. And so, 3 years later, when another astronaut from Group 3 took off alone in a T-38 bound for Alabama to visit family, the aircraft would kill again. But this time, it wouldn't be a bird. It would be a loose piece of hardware, forgotten during an inspection, lodged in the single most lethal spot inside the flight control system. The part was less than half an inch across, a loose nut, or perhaps a maintenance rivet, forgotten inside the lateral control system during routine maintenance. Nobody saw it. Nobody missed it. And on October 5th, 1967, it killed Clifton Curtis Williams at more than 600 miles per hour. Williams was 35, major in the United States Marine Corps, unusual inside the astronaut corps. Test pilot from Patuxent River, selected in Group 3, the same class as Ted Freeman. Everyone called him CC. He was married to Beth Ann. They had 2 daughters. To understand what Williams meant to NASA that autumn, you have to look at Deke Slayton's roadmap. Williams had been the backup pilot for Gemini 10 and backup lunar module pilot for Apollo 9. In the standard rotation, 3 backup assignments meant one thing: prime. C.C. Williams was the lunar module pilot of Apollo 12. He was in line to walk on the moon. That morning, he took off alone from Patrick Air Force Base in T-38A number NASA 922. Destination: Mobile, Alabama. Purpose: visit his parents. There was no official mission. There was no rush. The Talon climbed to cruise altitude over the Florida Panhandle. And somewhere in the climb, the loose part found its terminal position. It seated itself inside the aileron control mechanism. It jammed the linkage. In that instant, the T-38 stopped being a flyable aircraft. Williams tried to level. The ailerons did not respond. The right wing dropped. He tried to counter. The ailerons stayed locked. The aircraft started a slow, unstoppable roll. In 10 seconds, it was inverted. In 20, it was diving nearly vertical toward the pine forest north of Tallahassee. On the emergency frequency, there was one transmission. Mayday, Mayday, NASA 922 ejecting near Tallahassee. Williams fought to recover the aircraft far past the point where another pilot would have punched out. By the time he finally pulled the handle, the parachute barely had time to deploy. The NASA report was explicit. Mechanical failure, not pilot error. The part that jammed the ailerons did not belong to the aircraft. An industrial ghost that no pilot could have caught on the ground. Pete Conrad, the assigned commander of Apollo 12, had lost his lunar pilot and a close friend. Alan Bean took the seat. In November 1969, it was Bean who walked on the ocean of storms alongside Conrad. But when the crew designed the mission patch, Conrad made a personal decision. The patch shows the Yankee Clipper above the lunar surface, with 3 stars, one for each crewman: Conrad, Gordon, Bean. And a 4th star, smaller, set apart, nameless. That is Clifton Curtis Williams, the astronaut who never got there. That patch flew to the moon in November 1969. It is the only thing left of a man who should have been there. With Williams, the count of NASA astronauts killed in the T-38 climbed to 4. Freeman, C. Bassett Williams, 4 members of the astronaut corps in the same model of aircraft, in less than 3 years. But while NASA was reviewing its Talon procedures for the 4th time, 2 other men were preparing to die that same autumn. Neither of them would fly a T-38. Neither of them appears in the official list of dead astronauts that NASA recognizes today without qualification. One died crossing the edge of space at Mach 5. The other died trying to land a fighter at Edwards 23 days later. And his name would take 30 years to appear on the official memorial to fallen astronauts. Adams crossed the threshold first. On November 15, 1967, Major Michael Adams dropped from a B-52 mothership over the Mojave Desert, lit the rocket motor of the X-15-3, and in less than 5 minutes climbed to more than 50 miles above the surface of the Earth. 50.4 miles. 400 feet above the threshold, the Air Force had set for the title of astronaut. The instant his altimeter crossed that line, Adams became the 7th American to fly above space inside the X-15 program. 4 minutes later, he was dead. One caveat before we go on. Adams and the man we are going to talk about next are not part of the official NASA astronaut corps. The X-15 was a joint project between NASA, the Air Force, and the Navy, with a 50-mile altitude threshold, not the 62 miles the Fédération Aéronautique Internationale recognizes today. The MOL program was an Air Force military orbital laboratory that was canceled before it ever launched. but both men were actively training to fly to space when they died. And both men died flying American military hardware. Adams was 37, test pilot from Edwards. In 1965, he was selected for MOL, but a year later, he asked to transfer to the X-15. He wanted to fly higher and faster. He was married to Frances Ann. They had 2 daughters. Flight 36597 reached apogee without incident. And then something inside the inertial reference system started giving confused readings. Adams started a slow pitch up instead of leveling off. The aircraft drifted in yaw. The engineers back at Edwards couldn't interpret the data in time. Adams couldn't see it correctly either. His attitude indicator had been misaligned since the ascent. He flew blind through the critical seconds of the descent. At Mach 5, with the fuselage crosswise to the flight vector, the X-15-3 entered a hypersonic spin. No aircraft ever built by a human being had recovered from a spin at that speed, and none has since. When Adams managed to momentarily stabilize the aircraft, the aerodynamic loads exceeded the structural limit of the airframe by more than 15 times. The X-15-3 broke apart in the air. The wreckage was scattered across more than 40 miles. He never activated the ejection sequence. His name would not appear on the memorial to fallen astronauts until 1991, 24 years after his death. 23 days after Adams, another military astronaut climbed into another American aircraft at Edwards. Robert Henry Lawrence Jr. was 32, major in the Air Force, doctorate in physical chemistry from Ohio State University. In June 1967, 5 months before he died, he was selected for MOL. With that selection, he became the first African-American astronaut in the United States. It was not made public. MOL was a classified program, a military orbital laboratory disguised as a science project whose actual purpose was high-resolution photographic reconnaissance over Soviet territory. Lawrence's face would not appear in the American civilian press for decades. He was married to Barbara. They had a young son. On December 8, 1967, Lawrence was training another pilot in an approach technique called flare landing, a nearly vertical descent with an aggressive level off in the final instant before touchdown. It simulated the re-entry of a spaceplane the Air Force was already studying in secret. The aircraft was an F-104D Starfighter, 2-seat. The trainee was in the front. Lawrence, as instructor, was in the back. The descent was too steep. The trainee tried to level off too late. The F-104 hit the runway with excess speed and angle, bounced, and the landing gear collapsed. The aircraft caught fire as it slid off the asphalt. The front pilot ejected and survived with serious injuries. Lawrence ejected as well, but the F-104 was rolling sideways against the ground. The ejection sequence launched him horizontally instead of upward. He died on impact. Robert Lawrence had everything he needed to have been the first African American in space: doctorate, test pilot wings, official selection, active training. He never flew because an F-104 drifted a few feet too far on a runway at Edwards. His name would not appear on the official memorial to fallen astronauts until 1997, 30 years after his death. The public debate over whether he was or was not an astronaut was only settled when the MOL archives were declassified, and it was documented in writing what the Air Force had known since 1967. With Adams and Lawrence, the count climbed to 6. 3 were left, and those 3 did not die in an aircraft. They died inside the very spacecraft that was supposed to take them to the moon, on the ground, without ever launching. During a test NASA considered so routine that there were no firefighters stationed at the pad, and their deaths are the reason Neil Armstrong got to walk on the moon. On January 27, 1967, 3 astronauts sat down inside an Apollo capsule on top of a Saturn 1B rocket at Cape Kennedy and began a test that program managers considered so safe they had formally classified it as non-hazardous. There was no fuel in the rocket. There was no armed pyrotechnics. There were no firefighters at the pad. It was, in the words of the operations manual itself, a routine rehearsal. 5.5 hours later, the 3 of them were charred inside the cabin. Virgil Yvonne Grissom was, by a wide margin, the most experienced astronaut the United States had ever put inside a spacecraft. Lieutenant Colonel in the Air Force, 40 years old, combat pilot in Korea, with 100 missions flown. Second American in space, with Mercury 4. Commander of the first crewed Gemini flight, alongside John Young. Edward White II was the first American to walk in the vacuum. Lieutenant Colonel in the Air Force, 36 years old. During Gemini 4 in June 1965, he stepped out through the hatch and floated 23 minutes tied to an umbilical cord, while America watched live on television. Roger Chaffee was the youngest of the 3 and the only one who had never flown. Lieutenant in the Navy, 31 years old, photo reconnaissance pilot during the Cuban Missile Crisis. Apollo 1 was going to be his first space flight. The spacecraft was Command Module 12, Capsule CM-012, the Block 1 version of Apollo. And this is where the story stops being a tragedy and starts being an indictment. The Block 1 was the first operational design of the Apollo capsule, built by North American Aviation in Downey, California. It was never intended to fly to the moon. It was a development version. When Capsule CM-012 left the plant and arrived at Cape Kennedy in August 1966, it dragged with it a list of open defects with more than 200 documented items. Grissom knew, and he was furious. Months before the test, during a capsule review in Downey, he picked a lemon from the tree in his front yard in Houston, carried it to California in his flight bag, and hung it from the command module simulator. When they asked him why, he answered with 2 words: because it is. Weeks before January 27th, he sat for an interview for a NASA documentary. He said on camera, a sentence the agency kept in its archives: "If we die, we want people to accept it. We're in a risky business, and we hope that if anything happens to us, it will not delay the program. The conquest of space is worth the risk of life." The test on January 27th was called Plugs Out. It consisted of disconnecting the capsule from all external service lines and running it exclusively on its own batteries, simulating the electrical conditions of a real launch. The 3 men climbed into the cabin around 1 in the afternoon. The hatch closed behind them. The cabin was pressurized with 100% pure oxygen at 16.7 pounds per square inch, 2 pounds above normal atmospheric pressure. That detail is what kills all 3 men. In orbit, the Apollo capsule operated on pure oxygen at 5 pounds per square inch, roughly a third of atmospheric pressure. At that pressure, pure oxygen is breathable and relatively stable. But on the ground, to verify the capsule's seal before launch, NASA raised the pressure above atmospheric, and 16.7 pounds of pure oxygen turns any flammable material into an explosive waiting for a spark. And inside CM-012, there were flammable materials everywhere: Velcro to hold loose equipment, nylon nets to organize wiring, hundreds of pages of paper manuals, foam insulation panels, adhesive tape, nylon flight suits. The test was running late. Communications were failing. At one point, Grissom snapped into the microphone what would become his last documented public sentence: "How are we going to get to the moon if we can't even talk between 2 buildings?" At 6:31 and 4 seconds in the evening, local time, a short circuit in a wire with damaged insulation under Grissom's seat generated a spark. The spark found Velcro. The Velcro found pure oxygen at 16.7 pounds. In less than a second, the entire cabin was on fire. Chaffee shouted into the microphone, "We've got a fire in the cockpit!" White tried to open the hatch. The Block 1 hatch opened inward, against the rising pressure of the cabin. It was designed that way because, in theory, the internal pressure in orbit would help keep it sealed. But, in a fire on the ground, the internal pressure turned it into a lid that was impossible to move. Under normal conditions, it took more than 90 seconds to open from the inside. White didn't have 90 seconds. He had 17. The pressure rose so fast that the wall of the module ruptured from the inside. Technicians ran with extinguishers toward the hatch, but the heat, the dense smoke, and the flames kept them back. It took more than 5 minutes to open the capsule. When they did, there was nothing left to do. The official cause of death was not the fire. It was asphyxia from inhalation of toxic gases generated by the combustion of the nylon, Velcro, and paper inside their own pressurized suits, which had melted and fused to their bodies. The NASA investigation, led by engineer Floyd Thompson, produced a 3,000-page report. The conclusion can be summed up in one sentence. The accident was not caused by a failure. It was caused by an entire system that was badly designed. The redesign transformed Apollo completely. The Block 2 hatch opened outward in less than 7 seconds. The ground cabin atmosphere was changed to a 60-40 mix of oxygen and nitrogen at ambient pressure. Velcro was replaced with fire-resistant materials. Nylon was replaced with beta cloth, a Teflon-coated fiberglass fabric that could not burn. The wiring under the seats was redesigned, rerouted, and shielded with arc-proof insulation. The program stopped for 21 months. When the United States launched another crewed capsule in October 1968, it was a completely different spacecraft. The mission was called Apollo 7. It flew 11 days in orbit without a single structural problem. And here is the revelation that justifies this entire documentary. If the fire that killed Grissom, White, and Chaffee had happened 2 years later, in orbit, in an identical Block 1 capsule on its way to the moon, NASA would have lost 3 astronauts with no way to rescue them. The capsule would have continued its trajectory with 3 bodies on board until the oxygen ran out. The accident would have been invisible, unexplainable from a distance, and it would have shut down the American crewed space program, almost certainly, permanently. Congress would have cut the budget. The Soviet Union would have reached the moon first, and the names Neil Armstrong, Buzz Aldrin, and Michael Collins would never have gone down in history for doing what they did on July 20th, 1969. Grissom, White, and Chaffee died on the launch pad at Complex 34 without ever taking off. And because they died there, they forced the redesign that made it possible for the Eagle to land 30 months later. The line Grissom had spoken to NASA's camera came true to the letter. His death did not delay the program. His death saved it. 9 funerals paid the price for the Eagle to land. But the 9 crewed missions that did fly after Apollo 7, the ones that did reach the moon and come back, came far closer to adding to that count than NASA admitted at the time. An oxygen tank blown apart 200,000 miles from Earth. A lightning strike that ran through an entire capsule during ascent. A valve that decided not to close. A crewman unconscious during re-entry. Every emergency of the Apollo program, minute by minute, in the next video.